and welcome to Waterloo Stories podcast. I'm Sam Toman. I'm the interim editor of the Waterloo Alumni and Friends magazine, and our spring 2019 issue is on urbanization, and basically how people all over the world are rushing pretty quickly and moving to major cities, and how we're coping with that change. Joining me today are two researchers from the University of Waterloo. With me is Robin Mazumder. He's a mental health and occupational therapist, a Waterloo PhD candidate in cognitive neuroscience, and a member of Waterloo's Urban Realities Lab. Did I get that right, Robin?
Yeah, I'm just not a practicing occupational therapist anymore. I can't say that I am, otherwise I get dinged by the college. So
okay.
I used to be one.
All right, good to know. And also with me is Professor Brian Doucet. He's a researcher in Waterloo's Faculty of Environment and a Canada Research Chair in Urban Change and Social Inclusion. And Brian, your work, I guess, reaches into many different aspects of urban life, but ultimately I'd say you're interested in equity and how we design our cities to make them more fair.
Yeah, really thinking about the nexus of housing and affordability and housing justice and how that intersects with things like transportation and mobility. Okay,
great. So just a few facts just to kind of set the table a little bit. The urban population of the world has grown rapidly. So in 1950, there were 751 million people living in cities, and today there are close to 4.2 billion people living in cities. And this has been just incredible growth. Most of this growth actually has been in Asia and Africa. Europeans and North Americans generally had already urbanized by 1950. But there are definite changes in urbanization that are happening in North America, in Canada specifically. So recently I was watching TVO, and they had a crazy stat that was, it said there's only 25 cities in Canada that are actually growing, which I think would surprise a lot of people. And definitely there's some opportunities there for the growing cities, but also probably some challenges for all different kinds of cities. Now, the reason I wanted both of you guys to come in was you guys are both pretty active on social media and just in the online and offline conversations we're having about these problems or problems related to urbanization. I guess just starting off, Robin, maybe you could start. How would you characterize the conversation that's happening online?
I think there are two giant echo chambers. Sometimes they interact and they can be pretty negative. So I guess in one camp, you've got the fierce urbanists who want bikeable, walkable cities, no parking, high density. And then in the other camp, you have, I don't know, for the lack of a better term, the driving camp. And I think those people are probably worried about their commutes being affected negatively by these other modes of transport that are finding their way into our cities. And so sometimes when those two echo chambers interact, it can be pretty nasty. And so within the echo chambers themselves, I think I can speak to the urbanist one.
Yeah.
I think it's great. I think Twitter is a really great forum for knowledge exchange and also as a tool for advocacy.
Yeah.
It's like sending an email, but like everyone can see it and then everyone can jump in on it. And when we're trying to make change in our cities, sadly, I think that politicians and decision makers respond to shame. And so it's about finding a balance between being constructively critical and also just keeping people accountable in a public forum.
Yeah. So Brian, are you shaming public officials on Twitter?
Well, I have been known to make a few videos that highlighted some of the challenges of simply crossing the street. And I think that did get the attention of people in this echo chamber that Robin speaks about, but also got the attention of people who were designing those types of mobility systems. I think it's important, though, I mean, we're talking about the online discussion, but I think it's important, and I agree with Robin, that especially for me coming into this community last year and being on social media, being able to make critical connections with a lot of people who share similar values, similar approaches to cities. But I think we have to be a bit careful of sort of planning via Twitter. in the sense of this is one conversation or a multitude of conversations that, as Robin said, is a bit of an echo chamber. And if we're trying to look at overall conversations in cities, I'm of the firm belief that anyone who lives in a city has a equally valid opinion of what's wrong, what needs to happen, what can be done. But on social media, we're only seeing a small slice of that. And I think Robin pointed that out with mobility, right? We've got the drivers and basically the drivers and the people who can walk, drive, cycle, and take public transit, right? But there are many other perspectives, equally valid perspectives about our communities that I don't think are always represented on social media.
So who is being represented on social? Like, why do you think a certain kind of person is attracted to social media, and what is that person?
That's a whole other conversation on the psychology of who's attracted to social media. Obviously, I think based on the technology that's required to use it, people who own phones or computers. I don't know, maybe a younger demographic than usual. I don't think my grandmother's tweeting. And I think her opinions, like Brian's saying, are extremely important to the conversation on cities. I mean, she's in her 70s, she's osteoarthritic and has a number of other health issues that affect the way that she experiences the city. So anyways, I don't think I answered your question.
No. I mean, I just wonder, like, when I'm on Twitter, I feel like it's a lot of bros on Twitter, like a lot of dudes. It's maybe harder to find conversations that, like, fully reflect the diversity of the city. And I kind of wonder why that is.
I think in a way, if you look at the power relations, you look at who has a voice and who doesn't outside of social media, in some ways that is amplified on a platform like Twitter. Right? So those that already have the privilege to be in a position where they either go to planning meetings, they go to civic discussions, they write an op-ed, they read, they're out there more. It's not, there are exceptions to everything, but I think it also amplifies voices that are already quite prominent.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'll comment a bit on that. I think at the same time, like you said, there are exceptions. I think that some people who don't have the time or the resources to show up to meetings and consultations, often people, like, there's a few people on Twitter I follow typically. I mean, most of them have disabilities that I'm speaking about here, and they provide a perspective on cities that I think is extremely important, and they've identified that they have a lot of accessibility issues that prevent them from getting out to these consultations and to talk about these accessibility issues. So I think, I think men, dude bros definitely probably dominate the conversation on Twitter, but I have seen cases of people who I usually probably wouldn't even see at these, I was on the City of Kitchener's cycling committee, and I mean, no one ever came to those meetings, but if they did, they were like middle-aged white men. So,
Well, I guess that begs the next question. What is moving the needle, I guess? In these, like, are these discussions moving the needle and changing things in cities, or where do you think the change is happening? And then I guess who does the change benefit?
I think there are certainly a lot of discussions online that reflect wider discussions offline. I think if I take a look at some of this urbanist, cycling debates, which I've wasn't really that into when I lived in the Netherlands, to be honest. But have become
nothing to debate about.
Well, they do. It's just that needle is just a lot further along. So I think there's a lot of talk on social media that celebrates one particular view of what makes a city good, prosperous, livable, successful, good quality of life, but it actually often ignores some of the consequences of that. So if we think about a lot of the debates that both Robin and I are involved in that talk about livable cities, that talk about good cycling infrastructure, that talk about walkable communities, all these wonderful things in cities, and this isn't just something with the online discussion. This happens in discussions more broadly about this quality of life, livable urbanism. There's a whole social consequences that are kind of pushed to the side or ignored or maybe papered over, in the sense that all these things that we're talking about of being wonderful things in cities end up making those spaces within those cities more desirable, consequently more expensive, and then you end up pricing people out of those areas that get nicer, right? It's this what I like to call the paradox of quality of life improvements.
Yeah.
You improve an area with a new cultural facility, better infrastructure, better cycling amenities. You make that area more desirable, more attractive, and consequently more expensive. And it's that part of the conversation of how do you having things like housing or preventing forms of displacement as a result of those improvements, they're almost an afterthought in those discussions. I rarely see them in these online discussions about let's put in a new bike lane, let's get a great parks in our community. There are negative sides to that, and they tend not to be very prominent on social media. They tend not to be very prominent outside of social media as well. But it's that linking of improving cities, but doing it in a more equitable way, where that equity is front and center.
So that's interesting because, one of the emerging ideas, I guess, is that in the future, or as these cities, as we urbanize and as more infrastructure, active transportation infrastructure gets built, people who are less affluent will be the ones who are still driving because they can only afford houses that are further away from transit infrastructure, because transit infrastructure in North America especially is scarce. So, I mean, I just kind of wonder, you personally, when you are discussing these things online, how do you approach that dynamic? Because obviously cars are impacting the planet, impacting people's health, but then you don't want to scare people away from the point you're trying to make.
Yeah, I mean, I always try to appeal to someone's sense of compassion or their kids. I think that making arguments for better infrastructure to get less people or to take people off the roads from an environmental perspective is I think potentially powerful. I know that in the city of London, like London, UK, they're doing lots of stuff around air pollution, and people are like dying from asthma attacks. And one of my friends is the I think the deputy manager of air quality in the city of London, the mayor's office, and he was saying that the majority of the pollution in London is from cars, and that one day someone's going to sue the city to change what's on the death certificate as the cause of death to air pollution, and they're waiting for that to happen. And I think that is the way that I would hopefully disarm someone from being reactive. We're all pretty self-absorbed, myself included, and I think it's hard to really look at the bigger picture. But when the bigger picture like kills your niece or something, I think that might be one way to go about that conversation.
I mean, this is very difficult to do in however many characters you now have in a tweet, but it's trying to make those relationships or those connections between things like mobility and housing affordability and how people get around being not just a product of the choices that they make and the infrastructure they have at their disposal, but the amount of money that they earn and the amount of wealth that they have. So sometimes that's difficult to do in a tweet. I recently had an article published in the Toronto Star essentially saying, look, I have to drive every time I go to Toronto because I have no choice. So it was initially because there are no trains, right? We have a few trains that can get us to Toronto for the working day, but anything else, it's driving. And so it started off as this article that was really about mobility, but then linking that to the housing affordability crisis or the multiple interpretations of that in a city like Toronto, that most people can't afford to live in an area with good transit. And so they end up driving further out on the 401 until they can afford a mortgage. So actually that article was more about housing inequity and how that plays out in our urban regions than it was about mobility pure and simple, because the two I think are inherently related, and I see the major fault lines in our cities today kind of emerging or coalescing around different types of built form that enable you to travel around in different ways. So there are many parts of our cities where you can only really drive.
Yeah.
right? And so there are other areas where you can drive, you can cycle, you can walk, and you have decent transit. And this, to me, is really where the fault lines kind of fall, not between drivers and cyclists, but between people can only drive, and driver, cyclist, pedestrian, transit user.
So it's about choice, you're saying.
It's about areas where you have choice, and areas where you really don't. And it's the areas where you have choice that are becoming much more expensive. These are the areas that are rapidly gentrifying. These are the areas where a lot of the affordable housing is disappearing because it's being either torn down or it's being redeveloped.
Yeah.
And so when you're thinking about these mobility options that you have in different places, you also have to think about housing. Yeah. So how do you ensure that, yes, if we have areas that more and more people want to live because they have mobility choices, what kind of policies do we need around housing to ensure that there are a wide spectrum of the population that are able to afford to live in these areas? That's how, to me, the two are linked. Again, difficult to say in a tweet, maybe in a short thread, but that's really, I think, where I try and bring that into the discussion.
Do you think the areas that are becoming more attractive are becoming more attractive because the people who live there have the time to show up to meetings and advocate for cycling infrastructure? Or these other types of things? Like, what do you think is driving that?
So that's interesting, because that is what I heard from one of the people I interviewed for the magazine, Becca Mayers. I think, you know her from Twitter.
Yes.
And
met in person at a conference too, but met
really?
via Twitter, which is interesting because a lot of people who I've later met in person and sometimes working with first connect with on social media, including Robin.
Yeah, I guess that's true with Robin too. So that's what she was saying. So, Vancouver's gone through like a massive transformation. The housing affordability thing they haven't figured out. It's worse than Toronto. But the cycling infrastructure they have. And she was saying that now it's kind of the wealthy urban dwellers who are the most vocal, have the most time to show up to meetings, and are creating the most path dependency towards cycling infrastructure. So
I was just in Washington last week. I was giving the keynote for the National Bike Summit, which is basically the biggest gathering of urban cycling advocates in the country, and it was really, really great to see a lot of women of color there, because that's a voice that I think is often not either seen or amplified in these conversations. And one of the things that came up was like, how do you race and class intersects with these sorts of things, along with wealth and these kind of hip core areas that have cycling infrastructure. But it's like, how do you give people like that a platform to advocate for their needs? And there are some systemic issues that I think that inhibit these types of people from participating in the democratic process that leads to the change that we see in our cities. And so a lot of these people are actually active on Twitter. They blog a lot, and that's where the visibility comes in. And so I just think that's an important thing to talk about in this conversation as well. I mean, you may not see it as much in Waterloo or Kitchener, but in larger cities, there's a lot of segregation when it comes to things like race and class, but probably mostly race. And those cities are those parts of the cities are typically not included. And I think we have to ask ourselves why.
I just want to shift focus for a second to affordable housing, because I think there are similar kinds of debates happening about affordable housing, and most notably NIMBY versus YIMBY debates. You guys can look that up if you don't know what it is. It basically means not in my backyard, so that is generally characterized as older people who live in established neighborhoods who don't want a lot of density near their homes, and younger people who are having problems affording properties and are advocating for any kind of density because, in their mind, more supply will bring down the cost of housing overall. Now, there's definitely flaws with both of that thinking, and I just was wondering if you guys had a perspective on how that particular debate plays out, because there's a more kind of generational and class component to that, adversarial almost, I'd say.
Yeah. I mean, I can appreciate why people get freaked out. We live in a society that's kind of built on fear, and finances are an issue. And if people feel like they've been saving their whole life and paying this house off, and that's their like nest egg, and then some boarding house or something gets built next to it, their money's going to drop. And so I think from my perspective, I can appreciate why people feel that way. I don't think it's appropriate, but I think that we are constantly reminded of what we should be scared of, and being broke and not having any money is one of them. And I think that ties into why people get so up in arms. On top of that, there's also the stigma associated with these types of housing developments and who that brings into the neighborhood. And I think that's something that we have to talk about. There's obviously, like we talked about, race and class issues involved with that. When I was in Washington, I heard there was a community, a pretty wealthy community in Arlington on the other side of the river. And they were really mad about scooters because it was bringing kids who shouldn't be there into their community. And it just made me think of this: who's supposed to be in your community? Is this your community? Do you own this community? Where does that? What? Yeah, right. But I think, so I think there's probably is a generational thing. Although I have friends in their 30s who own houses who were worried about safe injection sites going in the neighborhood.
Yeah. And, well, Robin, I don't really mean I do mean that stuff, and I know NIMBYs are definitely against that. But I'm talking more like the height restrictions, and they don't want, they want 6-7 stories instead of 20 stories. And I know some of your research, you touch on just the health impacts of our urban environments and skyscrapers and highways and stuff. And I was wondering if you could think about it from that perspective.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, my research looks at how being surrounded by these really tall buildings affects your psychological state. And it's kind of, I'm forecasting, so it's kind of predicting a dystopian future where all we have are really tall buildings around us and we can't see the sky, and trying to basically take a sledgehammer approach with the research to see if this is the worst case scenario. Like, before we get to that point, can we advocate for open space? So I think that's kind of my angle with my research. But I think, and Brian probably knows more about this because he's a subject matter expert on the density stuff, but I think there are ways to do density that doesn't involve super tall buildings. And I think super tall buildings come with a whole bunch of other things. I know, the Edmonton Winter Cities design guidelines, they talk about how tall buildings create wind tunnels in winter cities that just makes being on the street unpleasant, and it blocks light. And there's all these other things that have implications on our day-to-day experiences on the street. So I think moderation is the key. And I think the other thing that's important is for cities to do a good job of it when they do it, because you screw it up once and people are just never going to get over that. And in Toronto, I see a lot of really tall buildings that are just, we can't swear, that are not nice. And in a city like Kitchener or Waterloo, Toronto has a bunch of buildings and they kind of blend into the mix of the glass and whatever they have going on in Toronto. But here, if you have one really tall building and it's really ugly and it just ruins the feel of the community, like, that's going to create a
and it's going to be there for 100
exactly
years.
And that's the other thing we have to think about is our decisions about the built environment. Like, I don't think a few people don't think about this. Like, these are things that stick around unless there's some giant earthquake that just raises everything down. Like, we're stuck with these design decisions when it comes to the width of our roads, the aesthetics of the buildings, and that's because of we're talking about election cycles. Like, people make decisions in their political leadership positions now that have implications on people who live here 100 years from now. So anyways, I won't go on.
No, that's interesting. I mean, and Brian, I guess maybe your perspective from more of an equity and affordable housing.
So what Robin's just said is very interesting, and I think it's the part of the debate that's really present is the way a building looks. And you're right, we're going to be stuck with these buildings for a long time, and if they don't look nice, that will affect, as your research clearly shows, that will affect people's mental health, their well-being, their connection to the community. Where I'd like to see the conversation go a little bit more is not necessarily just what the building looks like, but the social implications of it. So what's inside the building? So the tenure, the ownership, the size of the units. Because again, if we build all these buildings, beautiful or ugly, we are going to be stuck with whatever a developer feels is most profitable to build in terms of unit sizes for as long as that building is there. It can be very difficult to retrofit a building to make the units larger once it's been built. And I don't feel we're having those kind of conversations. And again, the affordable housing discussions, I did some research recently where I had I had one of my grad students read every single article that the Globe and Mail has ever written that's mentioned the word gentrification. He dated back to 1980, about 800 articles, and he tracked them, and we came up with this typology of different articles and looked at how the term has changed over time. And it went from a period in the sort of 1990s when it was really kind of celebrated as here's a way to revive our inner cities. This will make areas hip and trendy, right?
Like,
the creative
class.
class.
Let's gentrify.
Yeah,
Like,
Displace
but,
people.
yeah, but that was the kind of, the middle class mainstream media discourse. More recently, as our cities have become so expensive, gentrification has become a middle class problem.
That's why we're talking about it.
Yeah.
That's why we're talking about
yeah.
it. Critical scholars, activists, low-income residents have talked about it for decades. It's only now that your non-Bay Street lawyer who's married to a teacher cannot afford a house in the core of Toronto on a subway line, right?
Yeah.
So now all of a sudden gentrification becomes a problem. Yeah. So this YIMBY, this yes in my backyard, is a very middle class interpretation of housing affordability. So that whole issue of affordable housing or housing affordability has actually become a middle class centered debate, which means things like, well, let's just have a few, let's build more market driven housing with the same profit based logic that we see in other forms of development, but let's make it a little bit below market rate. That might be good for your two teachers, right? But for your person working on a minimum wage with 3 kids, forget it. There's nothing that will benefit them from it. So we've lost, that critical perspective, that working class perspective on affordable housing has actually been evicted from these debates.
Yeah. And I think also too interesting is that as we move into more almost a service economy, the people who live in these neighborhoods, these gentrified neighborhoods, are demanding more services, but they don't want to pay higher prices. So the people who come to provide those services are making low wages, and then the burden for them to get to work is on them because they can't afford to live near their work.
So they have to drive.
They have to drive.
Yeah. They have to drive, or they have horrible commutes by public transit, 2 hours each way, a bus from the suburbs to the end of the subway line to another bus to get to where you need to go for your work, and then maybe somewhere else to do a second job, right? And that kind of perspective, I don't know, Robin, maybe you found it. I haven't really found it in a central way on things like social media, on Twitter.
Yeah, I think people don't talk about it because it doesn't affect them. The majority of the people on social media probably are that middle class demographic, and so they don't really care about the people who aren't, benefiting in the ways that they are. And it's interesting. I spent the summer living in London and the UK, and I was living in this grad student dorm right in Bloomsbury, which is like pretty central in London. Insanely expensive, and I didn't get much, for what I got, but I got a single bed in a tiny room, and I shared a bathroom with 10 people, and that is more expensive than my rent in Kitchener. Just for students at UW, just realize how lucky you are to not have to spend $2,000 a month for anyways. So as part of this residence, there was a woman there. She was like the housekeeper. Each floor had someone who helped clean up. That was kind of part of your rent, and also just to make sure the place didn't erupt into complete chaos. But she was Bangladeshi, which is how we connected because my family's from Bangladesh. And I was talking to her, and she commuted about 2.5 hours in to work. So that's like 5 hours.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
To make not that great money, and anyways, so like that's 5 hours of your day on and that's on transit too. So she couldn't even afford a car in London. So it's something that
and that's with London's transit.
And London has pretty good transit.
I can imagine being in Houston. Or
she was outside of London, but a couple of trains and buses and whatnot.
And certainly, so I spent 13 years living in the Netherlands, which has pretty much the opposite form of transit and mobility patterns to here, and also ideas about everything that Robin and others have been and myself now have been fighting for here, just basics, were developed 20 or 30 years ago in the Netherlands. Took a lot of struggles, but very different mobility system. And so coming back to Canada after living in one of the most one of the best planned countries in the world, has really heightened my awareness of the premium you pay here to be close to good transportation infrastructure. And I'm not talking about close to the highway, but close to that area, those areas where you can have choice, because they are a scarce resource. In a lot of European cities, not only is the transit and the cycling infrastructure more evenly distributed across the city and even the wider metropolitan region, but there are housing policies in place to actually have a large supply of non-market affordable housing in core areas or in the central city.
So from a conversation perspective, then, how did the Dutch get this done? Like, how did they use their voices to make that change happen 30 years ago?
The cycling change.
Or just the general change in affordable housing and the change in transit policy, and just to get that infrastructure built and to kind of get everybody on board with the program.
Yeah. So the housing piece and the cycling are two very different stories. And in fact, the cycling has gotten much better.
Oh, yeah.
And the housing has gotten worse.
Oh, okay.
In the Netherlands. It's still something we can reference to. Here's a different way of doing things, right? Here's a model.
Yeah.
We might not replicate it, but we can see that there are different forms of normality.
Yeah.
Right? But yeah, as a critical urban scholar in the Netherlands, I was also writing quite critically about housing policy and housing changes in the Netherlands, and the way gentrification was also being promoted. But the cycling piece, I mean, is one that people often like to hear about because, 50s, 60s, car use was going up in the Netherlands. Roads were being widened. There are examples even in Amsterdam where they demolished buildings and widen roads to bring essentially highways as close to the center as they could. And it got to a stage where thousands of people were getting killed or injured on roads, children in particular. It wasn't safe to cycle. It wasn't safe to walk. In these urban neighborhoods that were primarily lower income people, there was very little green space, so that kids played on the streets.
Yeah.
With increased car use, it was becoming unsafe. And this sort of broad movement started in the 1970s to try to make cities more accommodating to walking and cycling. One of the largest group was called Stop the Child Murder. And
it's pretty straightforward.
The Dutch are nothing if not very direct. And so I remember speaking to one of my colleagues who was a kid at that time, and he said, at the dinner table as a family, they were discussing road safety.
Wow.
And not activists, but ordinary people. And I think that's where the big shift needs to happen.
Okay, guys, I'm going to wrap this up with some stock questions. So I gave these to you guys in advance.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you wrote down your answers or not, but I'll start with you, Robin. Okay. So do you have any? You're very active on Twitter. You have a lot of followers. Do you have any tweets you're particularly proud of?
Yeah, I think the one that's pinned to my page right now. It just says cities should be designed for living in, not driving through, and it resonated with a lot of people.
That's really simple.
Yeah,
that's nice.
Yeah, I think that's what Twitter should be all about: is concise, simple messages that can resonate. I think reflecting on the use of Twitter as opposed to other social media apps, and I think Twitter is about like resonance. It's about seeing, Instagram, maybe someone wears something or something that you wear.
Someone ate something.
Yeah, Instagram story, the cafe you were having a coffee at or something. But Twitter is like a big forum for like conversation and ultimately, I think, validating concepts that we all kind of believe in. So that one I'm pretty proud of.
Is there one that you wish there was an edit button for?
No, actually, sometimes I tweet and delete, but I can't think of. I think I have like 50,000 tweets, so it's hard to think of a specific one. I do always want the edit button though when I make a spelling mistake, because like the grammar trolls just like come out. I feel like people wait for you to screw up on Twitter and then they'll just jump. And I don't know what the psychology behind that is, but making a spelling mistake is like a really great way for some like know-it-all to tell you screwed up. And I'm like, it's Twitter, but yeah.
And okay, so who do you think every city dweller should follow online?
So I think Jay Pitter is great. She is I guess like a consultant, and she does talks and stuff. She's a Black woman, and she talks a lot about the things that Brian has been talking about, and we've been talking about today around housing affordability and asking who isn't at the table. And when we look at the urbanism conversation in Canada, probably North America, or even globally, it's typically like white guys. And I think we need people like, no offense to you guys, but that's just the reality of the situation. And I think we need more people of color, and we need more women. And I haven't even gone to the other intersections, but I think, anyways, I think Jay does a pretty good job of representing that and providing an important perspective.
Nice. All right, your turn, Brian. You're on the hot seat.
Right.
So what tweet are you particularly proud of?
I think it's less that I'm proud of particular tweets, but I'm very happy with the way in which Twitter has enabled me to make critical connections in my new home. So it's more the people that I've been able to connect with, either only on social media. Right? There's a lot of people that I've had interesting discussions with and engagements with and never met in person, but also people where you post something, they post something, you end up connecting on social media, and that leads to new new ideas, new collaboration. And I think that's what I'm most proud of in terms of on Twitter doing that. Yeah.
So there's no tweets you
well, I mean, if you're going to press me for further, I mean, I think, so I posted a tweet earlier this year, or later last year, of just ordinary cycling in Amsterdam that sort of went a bit viral, just a video that I made, and it went around the world, basically. And that was pretty cool. I think some of the videos that I made last year about just beg buttons and crossing the street, I mean, that to me was sort of, I got a lot of people's attention in a good way and a bad way, but it was all positive for me because I was also pointing out something that to me was painfully obvious, right? You need to press a button to cross the street.
That's most of Twitter, though, right? It's pointing out the painfully obvious stuff, which is what's so painful.
That is.
I don't want to cut you off.
No, that is, but it did lead, some people at the region didn't like that, and they got in touch and wanted to have wanted to follow up with it. And for me, that was kind of telling as well. Was your next one's about
and then so who do you think people should follow online?
So I agree with Robin. I think Jay Pitter is a really good voice to hear. I think there are a lot of good academics who use their research and bring that into a public debate and try and make that research more accessible. So people like David Holchansky, for example, from the University of Toronto, who's very active in promoting not only the work that he does around inequality and polarization, but other people who are talking about those issues. I think if you're interested in cycling, one person that you have to follow is the cycling professor, the fietsprofessor, Martin ten Brommelstruit from the University of Amsterdam, who again uses that cycling research to influence wider debates. And then, every city is going to have various commentators and activists who are important to follow. I would say what's important for me is to follow the advocacy groups, the community organizations that may not necessarily be very active on Twitter all the time, the way people like Robin are to a large degree, and myself and yourself to lesser degrees. But and I'd say Robin is also someone who you should follow. Very, very insightful and always very, very engaging. But those organizations, so in Kitchener-Waterloo, there are groups like the Working Center, the House of Friendship, the Social Development Center, organizations like Fairbnb who are critically looking at Airbnb and its impact on really destroying urban civilization as we know it. Is sort of my take on what Airbnb and other property sharing websites are doing.
That's a whole other podcast
to our cities. Well,
that's a spicy take. Right?
I'm planting some seeds for me to come back on your show at some point. Excellent. But I would say in whatever community you're in, find those. If you're concerned about issues of social justice and that, find those organizations, follow them, and maybe you end up making some critical connections with them.
Awesome. I think that's a great place to leave it. So I want to thank you both for coming on. This was a great discussion. And I'll put in the notes, I guess, where people can find you online. So hopefully you get some feedback and the discussion continues.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Sam.
There's a neighborhood down at the far end of where the LRT is going to run soon, or maybe will be running by the time this podcast airs.
In Kitchener?
In Kitchener.
Yeah.
Down by Fairway Road. And
if you're a Waterloo student listening to this, that's the place that exists beyond the LCBO. You may not have been there.